I never expected to hear a scream so high-pitched it cracked a garden gnome's hat. But there she was, Karen, sprinting through my yard covered in brown sludge, slipping on her own flip-flops, and howling like she'd been doused in molten lava. Except it wasn't lava. It was something far worse. It was liquefied cow manure from a tank meant for fertilizing my cornfield, now spewing with full glory from what used to be my peaceful little outdoor shower. And as the neighbors peeked out their windows and laughed so hard someone actually choked on a popsicle, I thought to myself, this is what happens when you tap into the wrong man's plumbing. But to understand how this moment came to be, we have to rewind 3 weeks, to the first clue that something weird was happening in my backyard. It started on a Thursday morning, just after sunrise. I was sipping my coffee on the porch when I noticed something odd near my outdoor shower, the one tucked beside the shed and surrounded by jasmine vines. At first, I thought it was just the breeze nudging things around, but then I saw the muddy footprints, barefoot, small, and clearly fresh. I hadn't used the shower in days. That's when I noticed something even stranger. My ceramic garden gnome, who normally stood upright and saluting, was knocked over and turned to face the fence. It looked like he'd been trying to report a crime but got sabotaged mid-salute. I walked over, inspecting the area. The ground was damp. The nozzle was slightly loose. And then I heard it, the soft whirring of the water meter spinning inside the main panel. Water was flowing, but no faucet in my house was turned on. I followed the trail and it led me straight to the outdoor shower line. Someone had been using it. That someone wasn't me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had a gut feeling. And in this neighborhood, there's only one person who's ever demonstrated that magical blend of entitlement, nerve, and disregard for boundaries. Karen. Karen, our not-so-lovely neighbor from 3 doors down, was notorious for treating everyone's property like her own personal mall. Last spring, she asked if she could borrow my hedge trimmer for a quick job. She returned it 6 weeks later with gum stuck in the motor, and claimed it was like that when she got it. In the fall, she held a yoga retreat for 6 of her friends in someone else's backyard while they were on vacation. And let's not forget the time she tried to sell tickets to view a rare bird nesting in a neighbor's tree, only to be chased off by the actual homeowner with a rake. But this was a new low. Trespassing into my backyard for private spa time? That's a level of audacity even Karen hadn't attempted before. I needed proof. Not just for my own satisfaction, but because nobody ever believes me when I say she's behind this stuff. Karen has a way of pretending she's an innocent daisy while stomping on your roses in broad daylight. That's when I decided to install a motion-activated wildlife camera just above the outdoor shower. I disguised it as a hummingbird feeder and let it sit overnight. 2 days later, I checked the footage. And there it was. Karen, at 6:42 a.m., wearing a pink bathrobe, hair in rollers, carrying a mesh bag filled with shampoo bottles, strutting into my backyard like she owned the place. She placed a towel on the fence post, adjusted the temperature like she was in a luxury hotel, and began her routine. Scrubbing, humming, even doing stretches mid-shower like it was some kind of spa commercial. She didn't even look around. Not once. That's how confident she was. Or how clueless. I sat there stunned, both amused and furious. It was one thing to sneak around and steal water. But to make my property part of her morning hygiene ritual? That was war. I shared the footage with my buddy Dave, who lives across the street. He burst out laughing so hard he nearly spit out his sandwich. Then he said something that lit the fuse for everything that came next. He said if it were him, he'd make the next shower a surprise she'd never forget. That's when the idea sparked. See, what Karen didn't know is that I'm not just your average homeowner. I'm a hobbyist with a plumbing license, access to a full workshop, and a large storage tank of organic liquid fertilizer used for my garden. The kind that smells like a skunk's worst nightmare and has the consistency of lukewarm oatmeal. Completely safe for plant. Awful for humans. I didn't tell anyone at first. I just got to work. First, I rerouted the outdoor shower's water intake pipe. I installed a bypass valve, a pressure activator, and a remote switch, all hidden behind a fake panel in the shed. It took 2 nights and 3 energy drinks, but by the end of the week, the entire setup was complete. One flip of the lever and instead of cool, clean water, the shower would unleash the worst-smelling sludge ever engineered by mankind. Of course, I didn't want to just set it off randomly. Timing was everything. I needed Karen to walk into the trap herself, unaware, oblivious, and oh so confident. So I waited. I let her get comfortable. Every morning, she came in. Same routine. Same robe. Same smug expression. By now, I had enough footage to compile a Karen's Backyard Spa montage, with transition effects and soundtrack music. I didn't upload it yet. Then, one evening at a neighborhood potluck, I overheard Karen bragging. She told 2 new residents about her secret morning ritual, claiming she had special access to the best outdoor shower in the neighborhood. She didn't even hide it. She laughed and said, "It's not really stealing if nobody's using it, right?" That was it. That was the moment. I went home, checked my cameras, confirmed she hadn't noticed any of the plumbing changes, and flipped the remote switch to arm the system. Tomorrow morning, the real fun would begin. And so I waited, sitting behind the curtain in my upstairs office, camera in hand, breath held, nerves tingling like I was defusing a bomb made of fertilizer. The sun rose. Birds chirped. And like clockwork, there she was. Robe, towel, conditioner, the whole deal. She walked in like it was her own backyard. I watched as she turned the knob. A second passed. Then another. And then, with a sound like a burst fire hydrant, the shower exploded to life, drenching her in gallons of dark, viscous, rancid liquid. She screamed loud enough to startle a squirrel into dropping its nut. She flailed, slipped, and landed on her backside with a squish. Her scream echoed through the neighborhood like a siren of justice, and all I could do was sip my coffee, nod, and mutter to myself, "You picked the wrong shower, Karen." The moment Karen fled my backyard covered in liquid fertilizer and pure humiliation, I knew things were far from over. She was going to come back swinging, and I had to be ready. But as I sat there watching her slip and shriek her way out of my garden like a greased pig at a state fair, I couldn't help but feel proud. The plan had worked flawlessly. What she didn't know, however, was just how far I had gone to make sure her little morning trespass ritual ended with a bang. Or in this case, a blast of fermented compost concentrate. That morning wasn't just a victory. It was the final move in a long game of psychological chess. A game she started the moment she decided my backyard was her private spa. After catching her on camera that first time, I didn't immediately act out of rage. I knew Karen well enough to understand that impulsive reactions only fed her self-righteous ego. What I needed was a response so calculated, so poetic, it would leave her questioning her life choices every time she passed a shower head. I spent the first few days doing what any good tactician does, gathering intel. I adjusted the camera to a wider angle, repositioned the lighting so her features were unmistakable, and even upgraded the motion sensor to capture audio. Every smug giggle, every off-key hum as she lathered up, every time she muttered something insulting about my lawn maintenance, was now archived in high definition. Then came the next step, blueprinting the revenge. You see, I'm not just some DIY weekend warrior. I used to work for a sustainable farming co-op before moving into suburban life. That meant I had access to tools, knowledge, and a tank full of liquefied fertilizer meant to enrich soil, not exfoliate skin. It was potent stuff, earthy, pungent, and powerful. Used correctly, it could double crop yield. Used creatively, it could ruin someone's entire week. And so I drew up a plan with all the detail of a Hollywood heist. First, I identified the water source feeding the outdoor shower. I'd installed it years ago as a peaceful rinse-off spot after gardening, never imagining it would become the site of chemical warfare. The water line branched off from the secondary valve on the east side of the house, near the hose bib. I installed a concealed diverter valve, custom welded with 2 inlets, one for the regular water supply and one for the fertilizer line. Then I ran a secondary line underground, looping it through a filter chamber I built inside my garden shed. That filter was only for show, of course, to make the setup look harmless if anyone ever got curious. The real payload was in a 100-gallon tank I'd stored out back, hidden behind a lattice wall and some climbing vines. To regulate the pressure and make sure the effect was dramatic enough to be unforgettable but not dangerous, I installed a surge-activated booster pump. The result? A perfectly delayed, high-pressure blast that would unleash a full 5-second stream of thick, stinking sludge before shutting itself off automatically. I even included a switch I could flip from my office, just in case I wanted to manually trigger the response. The entire thing took about 3 long nights, half a dozen trips to the hardware store, and more duct tape than I'm comfortable admitting. But when I tested it with a dummy mannequin I'd found at a thrift store, I knew I had created something special. Watching that mannequin get doused in fertilizer like it owed someone money gave me the kind of satisfaction I hadn't felt since installing my squirrel-proof bird feeder. As I worked on the trap, I made a point of not confronting Karen. If she even suspected I knew what she was up to, she might stop coming. I needed her routine to remain predictable, so I pretended like nothing had changed. I waved when we passed on the street. I let her borrow my garden rake when she asked. And when I caught her talking to a new neighbor about her exclusive morning rinse, I just smiled. Every day that passed, I became more certain she thought she was untouchable. It was like watching someone walk blindfolded toward a tripwire they themselves laid weeks ago. Around this time, my neighbors began catching on to what was happening. Not everyone, just the close-knit few who'd had their own run-ins with Karen. Dave, from across the street, was the first to find out. I showed him the camera footage, and he laughed so hard he nearly passed out. He immediately dubbed the operation the Mud Bath Massacre and offered to help build a viewing platform in his attic. Then came Janelle and her husband Mike, whose rose bushes Karen once accidentally pruned into oblivion. They offered to provide moral support and snacks for the big day. And then there was Mr. Calhoun, a retired engineer with nothing better to do than speculate on hose pressure mechanics. We had ourselves a crew. The night before the fertilizer hit the fan, I sent everyone a simple text: "Showtime at 6:30 a.m. Don't be late." We all agreed to watch from our respective homes so as not to draw attention, but I knew we were all counting the minutes like kids on Christmas Eve. The morning unfolded exactly as planned. Karen crept into my backyard, as she always did, with her robes cinched tight and her flip-flops flapping against the concrete. She looked around briefly, then stepped under the nozzle. I waited until she was mid-shampoo. Then I hit the switch. The sound was incredible, a deep, pressurized hiss followed by a wet explosion. Karen's shriek was so loud it scared a flock of birds from the trees. She slipped trying to escape, rolled over a garden hose, and crawled out of my yard looking like she'd lost a fight with a portable swamp. I half expected her to run home and disappear in shame. But this was Karen. She came back 30 minutes later, changed into a new outfit, and with her phone pressed to her ear. Within minutes, a squad car rolled into the cul-de-sac. I watched from the window as she dramatically pointed to my backyard, still dripping from the incident, as if I'd assaulted her with radioactive waste. I calmly walked outside to greet the officers. They looked confused at first, but then one of them recognized Karen. Turns out this wasn't her first creative accusation. She once claimed her neighbor's Christmas lights caused her cat emotional distress. Another time, she tried to sue a Girl Scout troop for knocking on her door too loudly. The officers listened to her complaints with visibly strained patience before turning to me. I simply asked if they'd like to see the footage. Once they watched the video and saw her trespassing, using the shower uninvited, and essentially breaking into my backyard for days on end, they chuckled and said, "Well, that explains the smell." They left without giving me so much as a warning, and Karen stomped home, yelling about lawsuits and chemical burns. As she marched back to her house, leaving a trail of muddy footprints across 3 driveways, my phone buzzed. Dave had already turned the video into a short clip, complete with slow-motion replay and a dramatic musical score. He asked if he could share it in the neighborhood group chat. I told him to hold off for now. I wasn't done. Karen had just declared war, and I had a feeling she was about to escalate things in ways I never expected. And when she did, I'd be ready. Because while she was busy plotting her next tantrum, I was already 2 steps ahead, tightening the screws on a second surprise she wouldn't see coming. The calm after the fertilizer storm lasted less than 24 hours. I knew Karen wasn't going to let the humiliation slide. She was too proud, too entitled, and way too loud for that. I had hoped she'd retreat into her house for a few days, maybe reflect on her actions while Febreze bombing her robe. But no. By the next morning, she was stomping door to door like a manic politician with a grudge, spinning the story in her usual delusional fashion. According to her, she had been targeted in a hate crime involving chemical warfare and intentional fecal sabotage. The way she described it, you'd think I dumped a truckload of cow manure on her with a helicopter and a vendetta. She tried to rally support from neighbors, but no one was buying it. Everyone had seen the footage by now, either directly or through the grapevine. The moment Karen got blasted was already circulating on phones like wildfire, shared in group chats, private messages, and even among teenagers who added dramatic sound effects and captions like, "When karma hits hard." Still, Karen wasn't done. That same evening, I saw her marching toward the HOA office with a folder stuffed under her arm. She looked like a furious substitute teacher ready to hand out detention slips to the entire neighborhood. I knew exactly what she was about to do, run to the homeowners association and cry foul. And sure enough, the very next day, I received a notice taped to my door. It was stamped in red and read, "Complaint filed, emergency HOA review scheduled." That would have been hilarious if it hadn't been paired with an official request to attend a disciplinary hearing. Most people would have panicked, but I just smiled. I had receipts. I had timestamps. I had motion-triggered video, a log of water usage, and a chain of evidence that could convict her in the court of common sense. So when I walked into the HOA hearing that Friday evening, I wasn't worried. The room was full. Karen sat in the front, dressed in a white blouse and floral skirt like she was appearing before a judge on daytime television. She had brought props: a dry-cleaned bathrobe sealed in plastic, a pair of crusty flip-flops, and what looked like a used loofah. She had placed them neatly on the table in front of her like forensic evidence in a murder case. The board members, 3 retired volunteers and 1 painfully overeager guy who took HOA rules too seriously, called the meeting to order. Karen stood up, cleared her throat dramatically, and launched into a speech about community safety and decency being under attack. She claimed I had rigged a homemade booby trap. She said she was traumatized, that her skin may never smell right again, and that her personal privacy had been violated. It was such a theatrical performance that one board member actually raised an eyebrow when she described how the blast knocked the shampoo out of her hands and the joy out of her heart. When they gave me a chance to respond, I didn't speak much. I simply turned on my tablet and played the video. The one that showed Karen slipping into my yard multiple times, humming, adjusting the nozzle, applying shampoo, and making herself comfortable. The same video that caught her saying, "He never uses this thing anyway, and this is way better than my indoor water pressure." The board watched in silence, eyes slowly widening as the truth hit them in real time. Then came the fertilizer moment. The spray. The scream. The flip-flop flying through the air like a rubber boomerang. Even the most serious board member let out a muffled laugh. I paused the video and calmly explained the setup. That it was my private property. That the shower was meant for personal use. That I had evidence of repeated trespassing. That I used a harmless organic fertilizer, legally purchased and regularly applied to my garden. The fertilizer wasn't toxic. The setup wasn't dangerous, and most importantly, it only activated when the water valve was turned, something only someone invading my space would do. Karen stood up again and shouted that I was gaslighting the entire neighborhood, which was ironic considering she was the one who had been sneaking into other people's yards like a rogue raccoon. She accused me of hacking her phone, stealing her flip-flops, and even manipulating the footage. But no one was listening anymore. One board member gently asked her to sit down. Another leaned in to tell me, with an amused smirk, that no official rule had been broken. I left the hearing feeling vindicated, but also slightly on edge. Karen hadn't learned her lesson. She was angrier than ever. And sure enough, that night, I heard her out front yelling into her phone about legal recourse and full-blown lawsuits. The next morning, a white car rolled up to my house and a man in a cheap suit got out. He handed me a thin envelope labeled Notice of Intent to Pursue Civil Damages. I opened it on the spot and couldn't help but laugh. Karen was taking me to small claims court. She was demanding compensation for emotional distress, property damage to her robe and shoes, and permanent damage to skin sensitivity. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. I figured it would be a nuisance at worst. A formality. But Karen was planning something big. I caught glimpses of her walking around the neighborhood with a notebook, talking to neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years. She was trying to recruit witnesses. I even heard she hired someone to help her prepare her statement. It was like she thought this was her moment to shine, her legal comeback tour. So I did what any responsible neighbor would do. I prepared. I printed every photo, every water bill showing usage spikes, every time-stamped clip. I gathered written statements from Dave, Janelle, Mr. Calhoun, even the teenager who filmed the TikTok remix. I laminated the key screenshots and tucked them into a folder labeled Karen's Greatest Hit. The day before court, I even bought a new shirt. Not for intimidation. Just to make a point. On the front, it said Shower Season Champion with a little cartoon hose. I didn't wear it in the courtroom, of course, but I wore it right afterward for the interview outside. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The courtroom was a small space tucked behind the municipal building, where minor disputes over fence height and barking dogs were usually settled. Karen showed up dressed like she was headed to a funeral. Her expression was a mix of anger, performance, and desperation. She had a small stack of notes and a look of vengeance in her eyes. When the judge entered, we all stood, and then Karen began her performance. She spoke of betrayal. She referenced a violation of trust between neighbors. She cried, real or fake I couldn't tell. She said her dog refused to come near her after the incident. Then she made the mistake of saying the shower was part of a communal resource, implying she had some unspoken right to use it. That was my opening. I calmly presented my evidence. I explained how private property works. I showed the footage. I explained the plumbing modifications, including the safety precautions I took. The judge watched, unimpressed by Karen's dramatics. Then came the knockout blow. One of the neighbors had found a video Karen herself had posted a week before the incident, bragging to a friend on social media that she had a secret spa set up behind this clueless guy's house. I submitted it as evidence. Karen's jaw dropped. She tried to explain it away as a joke. The judge didn't buy it. In the end, the case was dismissed. Not only did she lose, but the judge issued a formal warning for trespassing and misuse of private property. The court even required her to reimburse me for the minor property damage she caused, like the cracked fence post where she mounted her towel hook. Outside, the cameras were already waiting. Local news had picked up the story after the viral video hit 500,000 views. I didn't say much. Just smiled, waved, and let them know I'd be installing a lock on the shower from now on. When they asked if I had anything to say to Karen, I shrugged and said, next time, maybe just after the courtroom humiliation, anyone with an ounce of dignity would have backed down. But Karen didn't have an ounce. She had gallons of entitlement and just enough self-righteous delusion to fuel her next act of revenge. You'd think being doused in fertilizer, publicly ridiculed, and legally crushed would be enough to teach her a lesson. But not Karen. No, she doubled down. And this time, she set her sights not just on me, but on the entire neighborhood. If she couldn't win through the law, she'd try to turn the court of public opinion in her favor. And when that failed too, she decided to go nuclear with the HOA. It started subtly. Passive-aggressive flyers began appearing in everyone's mailboxes. Anonymous, but laughably obvious in tone. They had lines like, "Is your neighbor harboring hostile plumbing?" and "Shower safety is everyone's business." There were cartoons of homeowners being sprayed by geysers labeled toxic water, and one truly absurd drawing of a man hiding behind a hose with devil horns. It was so childish I initially thought it was a prank. But then I spotted Karen walking door to door, slipping more of those leaflets under doormats while wearing a sun hat and sunglasses like she was in some low-budget spy movie. She even wore gloves, latex, as if we wouldn't know it was her. The neighborhood, however, wasn't amused. Not only had most of them already seen the video of Karen getting sprayed, they'd also heard her courtroom meltdown had made it into a local podcast's Idiot of the Week segment. A few neighbors even put up signs in their yards with cheeky phrases like "fertilizer-free zone" and "no trespassing unless you want a surprise rinse." Karen must have felt like the walls were closing in, so she did what Karens do best. Filed a formal petition to the HOA demanding I be sanctioned, fined, and forced to dismantle my outdoor shower entirely. The HOA, which up until now had remained fairly neutral, couldn't ignore the stack of paperwork she submitted. She claimed my shower setup violated Section 14B of the Community Code, something about improper outdoor installations that may cause environmental concern. Of course, the code was meant for things like leaking sewage or gray water runoff, not a rigged garden shower that went off only when an intruder turned it on. But Karen was clever in how she framed it, using vague language and pulling random policy quotes that sounded convincing on paper. I was summoned once again for a special hearing. It was to be held at the HOA clubhouse, this time with more formality, and I was told in no uncertain terms that the board would be reviewing my conduct as a homeowner. When I arrived, the room was packed. Karen had somehow turned it into a full-scale neighborhood spectacle. She sat front and center, holding a binder with labeled tabs and wearing a neck brace that hadn't been there the day before. I guess she thought looking injured would earn her sympathy points. There were a few gasps when she limped into the room like she was on the verge of collapsing, but anyone who had known her longer than 5 minutes saw through the act. When the meeting began, she was allowed to speak first. She launched into a tearful retelling of her trauma, explaining that the fertilizer shower left her with psychological scars, skin irritation, and a new fear of outdoor plumbing. She claimed I'd weaponized a home fixture, creating what she described as a booby trap for civilians. Her exact words. The room was uncomfortably quiet, not because people agreed, but because they were too stunned to laugh. She held up her robe again, dramatically unfolding it like a courtroom exhibit. Then she gestured to her binder and said she had over a dozen signatures supporting her petition. The board nodded politely and turned to me. I stood up and calmly handed out my own folder of documents. In it were high-resolution photos of Karen on my property, screenshots from the footage, a water bill analysis, and most importantly, copies of the HOA's own property boundary maps showing exactly where the outdoor shower sat, well within my lot. I also had a signed letter from a licensed plumber confirming that my installation met all code requirements. As I spoke, Karen tried to interrupt twice, but the board reminded her she'd had her chance. One member raised a copy of her flyer and asked why she had drawn devil horns on a neighbor's head. She didn't answer. Then, just when things were tilting in my favor, something happened that caught everyone off guard. Dave, from across the street, raised his hand. He stood up and asked if he could speak. The board hesitated but allowed it. Dave walked to the front, pulled out his phone, and played a video. It was Karen, from just 2 days earlier, talking to her friend at the coffee shop patio, laughing about how she'd planted the fake injury, and how she hoped the board would be stupid enough to believe it. The audio was crystal clear. The silence in that room was deafening. The board members exchanged glances, and one actually chuckled under their breath. Karen turned pale. She tried to stammer out some excuse, said it was sarcasm, that it was taken out of context. But no one bought it. One of the board members quietly closed her binder and leaned forward with a sigh. She said, in no uncertain terms, that the HOA was not a tool for personal vendettas. They were not in the business of babysitting grown adults feuding over showers. Then she turned to me and said, officially, I had done nothing wrong. Karen was dismissed from the room with a warning about submitting misleading materials and abusing the complaint system. As she left, several neighbors avoided eye contact. A few shook their heads. One even muttered good riddance under their breath. She stormed out, neck brace in hand, and didn't look back. After the meeting, a few of us lingered around the clubhouse. There was a collective sense of relief in the air. People laughed, shared stories, and patted me on the back like I'd won a neighborhood election. Mr. Calhoun brought out his flask and toasted, to righteous plumbing. Someone even suggested I make a calendar titled, The Fertilizer Chronicles, using stills from the footage. Back at home, I locked the gate leading to the backyard and added a new sign that read, Private property, not a day spa. I also installed a second motion camera, this time with audio, just in case Karen or any of her allies got brave again. But for a while, things were quiet. Karen vanished from sight for a few days. Her house was dark. No flyers. No patrols. No late-night stomping around. I assumed she had finally decided to give up. Then, late one night, I heard the sound of something dragging near my fence. I peeked out the window and saw her silhouette, crouching, trying to reach something on my side. I flipped the outside light on and she bolted. By the time I got there, all I found was a stack of soaking towels and a bucket of what looked like flower petals. Maybe she was trying to stage another spa scene for sympathy, or maybe just one last act of spite. Either way, it confirmed one thing: she still hadn't learned. But I had something planned for that too. I'd already been speaking to a lawyer, not to sue her, but to file a cease and desist for trespassing and harassment. And with everything she'd done now officially documented, including false claims to the HOA and court, it wouldn't be hard to make it stick. Karen had finally backed herself into a corner she couldn't flip-flop out of. The war wasn't over just yet. But the end was near. By the time Karen made her final mistake, she was already drowning in consequences she didn't understand. I had given her every chance to back off, to retreat into her own yard and keep her drama contained to her rose bushes and badly organized garage sales. But some people don't know how to stop digging once they've reached the bottom. They just keep going, convinced they're about to strike gold instead of more dirt. After the HOA dismissed her ridiculous accusations and her secret recordings came to light, most people in the neighborhood were done with her. She became more of a cautionary tale than an active threat. But in the shadows of her own mind, Karen had rewritten herself as the victim of a vast neighborhood conspiracy. And as she plotted her big finale, I was already 10 steps ahead, preparing to end the saga with a kind of justice that didn't come from courtrooms or HOA hearings, but from Karen's own hand, unknowingly pulled like a trapdoor lever. It started with a letter. Not hand-delivered, not an official notice, just a flimsy white envelope stuffed in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a piece of paper printed with big bold letters. I know what you did. I laughed. Genuinely. I hadn't received an anonymous threat since middle school, when some kid accused me of stealing his lunchbox and left a note in my locker written in crayon. This time, though, the stakes were higher. The letter was followed 2 days later by a visit from the local code inspector, responding to an anonymous tip that I had created an illegal waste disposal system in my backyard. The inspector, a man named Frank with a beard longer than my garden hose, took one look at my setup and burst out laughing. He complimented the craftsmanship, took a photo for his crazy complaints folder, and left with a bag of cherry tomatoes from my garden. But Karen wasn't done. Her desperation evolved into subtle sabotage. One morning, I found deep scratches along my backyard fence, as if someone had taken a rake to the wood. Another time, the lock on my shed had been tampered with. Nothing was stolen, but it had clearly been twisted with force. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I simply adjusted my cameras, installed a motion light that triggered an audio recording of a barking dog, and let her paranoia stew. That's when the opportunity for perfect revenge landed in my lap. A few weeks prior, I had started a project to install a second outdoor shower near the side of the house. This one wasn't functional yet, just the frame and piping in place, but it was visible enough to look like a finished installation. One night, while reviewing my footage, I caught Karen crouching near it, examining the valve, her fingers testing the nozzle like she was about to steal from me again. That's when the plan formed. I made it look real. I attached a dummy water line, sealed it with a cap, and connected a small pressure canister filled with dyed water and a non-toxic odorless solution used in theater productions for dramatic mist effects. It wouldn't harm anyone, but it would explode in a giant blue splash the moment the fake valve was turned. Then I waited. I let the dummy shower sit there, gleaming under a spotlight. I trimmed the bushes around it, put out fresh towels nearby, and even placed a bottle of lavender shampoo on a ledge. Everything about it screamed, "Please trespass here." And sure enough, within days, Karen returned. This time, in full disguise, hat, hoodie, and gloves, like she was on some kind of covert mission. She tiptoed into my backyard just after midnight, clearly thinking everyone was asleep. But my motion sensors were wide awake. She reached the fake shower, looked around nervously, then turned the valve. Instantly, the pressure system activated, releasing a burst of fluorescent blue spray that engulfed her from head to toe like she'd just lost on a game show. She screamed again. This one was more panicked than angry, like she'd been caught by something supernatural. And then she ran. Straight into the motion-triggered light, which blasted a recording of her own voice from earlier that year when she said, "It's not stealing if no one sees you." The next morning, she was at my door. Not angry, not yelling, just shaking, with a streak of blue still in her hair and mascara dripping down her cheeks. She claimed she had gotten lost and was just checking for damage from the recent storm. I didn't even respond. I simply looked over her shoulder at the two uniformed officers pulling into the driveway. I had already filed the report earlier that morning and given them all the footage. Trespassing, vandalism, tampering with private property. Karen stood frozen as the officers approached, calmly explaining that they'd like her to come with them for questioning. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She just stood there, drenched, defeated, and quiet for the first time since the entire saga began. The fallout was swift. Karen was issued a restraining order and placed on probation with a court-mandated behavioral program. The HOA officially blacklisted her from ever serving on any board or committee again. But the real punishment wasn't legal, it was social. No one looked at her the same way. People stopped waving. Children avoided her lawn during bike rides. A neighbor even planted a sign that read, "No Karen Zone," on his property as a joke, but it stayed up for weeks. She became an island, isolated by her own behavior. As for me, I kept my shower. I even built a third one, just for fun, out of salvaged stone and copper piping. It became a bit of a landmark in the neighborhood. People asked for tours. Parents joked about bringing their kids by for bad behavior reminders. The whole thing became a story passed down like a suburban legend, one that reminded everyone where the line was and what happened when you crossed it. And yet, despite everything, I sometimes wondered if Karen truly understood what she had done. If she ever looked in the mirror and realized the monster she'd become, chasing phantom battles in a war that only existed in her head. Or maybe, just maybe, she still believed she was the victim. That some grand injustice had been done to her because she couldn't use someone else's property whenever she pleased. Either way, it no longer mattered. My cameras were still up, my gate stayed locked, and the smell of fertilizer still lingered faintly near the first shower, like a memory carved into the soil itself. Karen had finally met her match. Not with fists, not with yelling, but with calm, deliberate consequences she never saw coming. And on one quiet morning, months later, as I watered my garden and sipped my coffee, I heard the faint echo of children laughing down the block. One of them shouted, "Don't go near the blue zone, or you'll get Karened." I smiled. It was over. Not with a bang, but with a lesson passed down, sealed in fertilizer and justice.